to introduce my colleague and, in fact, ex-student, I can't really believe it, from about 20 years ago, Dr. Emily Pott, who is speaking tonight with this very beautiful title, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, the Symbolism of the Centre and the Work of the Artist. And in fact, her PhD subject was on Jerusalem. She's written here, the original architectural form and decoration of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And I remember it was called the Dome of the Rock, symbol of a centre, I think, symbol of the centre. And I actually read it, which was absolutely wonderful to read, and it was, I have to say, very impressive. And I wish I could say it'd been made into a publication, and one day, hopefully, Emily, it will be. But it is in thesis form up in our library. Emily is currently the Director of Research Programmes here, which includes all the doctoral students and some MPhil students. And she supervises them. Yes, she supervises them and has been doing this since 2007. And I asked her this evening what exactly she was working on most of the time. And interestingly, because she plunges herself into the work of each student, so one week she will be looking at the symbolism of colour, for example, in Safavid art and architecture. And the next week it will be bronze iconography of the Russian Old Believers. So Emily is the person to go to, an expert on all subjects to do with sacred and traditional art. We'll test you later. So tonight it's wonderful to be listening to Emily talking about alchemical thinking, partly as conceived by such authors and alchemists as James Hillman and Robert Bosnak, as well as the work of Mircea, Eliade and Henri Corbin. The relationship between material image and creativity will be discussed in an attempt to rethink materialism and to remember spiritual matter and celestial earth. I asked her, in fact, what this was an image of, because I thought this looks like a piece of maybe 1950s abstract American art. But of course it's a beautiful piece of malachite and azurite with this wonderful piece by Jeremiah Hopkins underneath. But in any case, she will tell us about this, or about alchemy and art. So please welcome Emily Pott.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for coming today. Emma mentioned that I work with lots of research students, and I have to say that there are a few of them here tonight, and I think they'll recognize a lot of what I'm going to say, because most of what I talk about tonight and most of what I'm working on is really due to them. It's due to their work and how I understand arts practice and the traditional arts is really through my observation of them in a way, and through my endlessly asking them questions that they're patient enough to answer. So it's really due to them that I can stand here and talk about any of this. In fact, one of them, it's one conversation with one of them, maybe it's been a few years ago now, which was, I was bemoaning, sort of materialism. I think it had something to do with my teenage son's propensity for expensive T-shirts or something like that. And she said to me, well, this idea of materialism as being a bad thing, I think it's misconceived. In fact, we need to rethink the way we think of material. Material itself can be thought of in a different way, and there's a different way that then we can think of materialism. And this started me thinking quite a lot about that. And it seemed to chime with something written by John Dewey in the 20th century. Dewey's work was concerned with reinstating the experience of the artist and the viewer in a consideration of aesthetics. He felt that what he spoke of in relation to material was that there was what he talked of as an aura of mingled awe and unreality, which focused the discussion of the spiritual and ideal in relation to art. but that this excluded the discussion of material, and that material had become something to be explained away or apologized for. So what I want to talk about today is the experience of material, or the experience, sensible experience or aesthetic experience in another light, and try to think about it from another perspective. In terms of the knowing and insight that we can gain through the material itself and through perhaps engaging with it in a different way. And to do this, I'll be using the way that we work here at the Princess School, which is based on tradition. And what that means is it involves looking at examples from the past, not only in terms of their historical context, but also to understand how we can take what is done or thought or looked at there and see how it relates to what we're doing today, or how we can understand things today. So just to help you understand what I mean when I'm talking about tradition, there's lots of ways to define it, but I'll read to you a definition that's been useful to me, and it's from Thomas Merton. Tradition is not passive submission to the obsessions of former generations, but a living assent to a current of uninterrupted vitality. What was once real in other times and places becomes real in us today, and its reality is not an official parade of externals. It is a living spirit marked by freedom and by certain originality. Fidelity to tradition does not mean the renunciation of all initiative, but a new initiative that is faithful to a certain spirit of freedom and of vision, which demands to be incarnated in a new and unique situation. So when we think about this way of thinking about tradition, and when we talk about tradition, I think it's quite a confusing term, because in itself it includes a contradiction. It's both timeless and of our time. It's both permanent and changing. And this aspect of permanence and change coexisting means that a tradition is never immune to change unless it's no longer a tradition. So we can look at artwork in museums, and we can talk about it, but artwork cannot change there, and so it's no longer a living tradition. Whenever we're talking about changes or branches or versions, this is only possible if the tradition does exist, and any reforms or changes in the tradition are only possible because the tradition exists and is continuing. So it holds two things together. It's always in a state of immutability, and at the same time it's being updated under the influence of internal and external factors, and it includes both the origin and its deployment, and so it's this contradiction. And it's with this in mind that I started off on my journey to look at material, and I have to take you back to where I began, which was with, as Emma was saying, my engagement with the Dome of the Rock. This is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and it's sort of where my journey started. And I wasn't very happy with what had been written about the building because it was focusing solely on the historical context. And even a full understanding of that context didn't really apply. It was lacking. There was hardly any consideration of the building as a place of experience of those who came to it as pilgrims from all across the Islamic world, or of the potential inspiration of those who made the building in the first place, which all these things are difficult to consider, but I felt that there needed to be some attempt to try and consider these things. So I began to look more carefully at the building and ask myself why it looked the way it did. It was first constructed by the Umayyads in 691, so it's one of the first sort of building projects, Islamic building projects, and the Dome of the Rock sits at the center of that building project. And that dome that you just saw and the octagonal building around it surrounds this rock, which is at the center of the building. And this rock is on top of a cave, and the cave and the rock mark the summit of a small hill that's known as Mount Moriah, and it's sort of it's definitely not the center of the old city of Jerusalem, but it's certainly the spiritual center of the old city of Jerusalem. And the rock has been associated with visionary experiences since biblical times. And what's helped me to understand these experiences was the work of Mircea Eliade, who would call these types of visionary experiences hierophanies. And that word comes from the Greek for hiero, which is sacred, and phanein, which is to show. So it's a showing of the sacred, and it's like a break in space where that space becomes different, and where the sacred breaks into the profane. And he talks about it. I'll read how he speaks about it. For religious man, space is not homogeneous. He experiences breaks in it. Some parts of space are qualitatively different than others. When the sacred manifests itself in any hierophany, there is not only a break in the homogeneity of space, there is also a revelation of absolute reality as opposed to the non-reality of the vast surrounding space in which no reference point is possible. Hence, no orientation can be established. The hierophany reveals an absolute fixed point, a center. So, this string of hierophanies that are associated with this place begin with, at least the recorded string of hierophanies that are associated, begin with the event that's discussed in Genesis 22, where Abraham's called by God to go to Mount Moriah, to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains to sacrifice his son, and he offers his son but is stopped from proceeding. And following this experience, Abraham calls the place Yahweh sees, or Yahweh will provide. And then it's also associated with Bethel, or the house of God of Joseph's dream, which is described in Genesis 28. Joseph fell asleep on a rock, and this was the foundation of the ladder that was set up on the earth, between earth and heaven, and angels of God were ascending and descending from this ladder. And Joseph, in Genesis, Joseph says of the place, "How full of awe is this place? This is none other than the house of God and the gate of heaven." And then it's also associated with the city of David, and it's thought, the rock itself is thought to be the threshing floor that's described in 1 Chronicles, where King David has a vision of an angel of death that's again standing between earth and heaven with a sword held over Jerusalem. And the angel instructs David to, after the vision, and the Lord stops the angel from slaying everyone in Jerusalem. And the angel instructs David to build an altar on the threshing floor where this vision had occurred. And David does build an altar, but eventually this is where Solomon builds a temple in the place where the angel had appeared to his father David. And some think that the rock itself was the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple, the first temple. According to the Talmud, Solomon's temple was founded on the foundation stone, the center around which the earth was created. And it's said that God took a stone from underneath his throne and placed it in the center, plunged it into the abyss, basically, and that this rock holds back the waters of Tehom, which is the chaotic waters underneath. So the rock itself is a piece of God's throne in this way of thinking. And it's here that the Ark of the Covenant was thought to have been placed with the two angels above the mercy seat, as are shown here in the image. And this is the place of God's indwelling, or his immanence, is the mercy seat. And this, we know for certain that this was the site, or almost all archaeologists agree that this was the site of the second temple, built during the reign of King Herod and destroyed in 70 AD. And a rock is also mentioned in another Jewish tractate, the Mishnaic tractate Yoma, and it describes it this way. After the Ark of the Covenant was taken away, a stone remained there from the time of the early prophets, and it was called Shatia, or foundation. It was higher than the ground by 3 finger breadths. And the rock is then also mentioned a further time by a Christian pilgrim that comes to Jerusalem in 333 AD. And this Christian pilgrim records that there's a pierced stone, that the Jews still come to this pierced stone and they weep, they anoint the stone and they weep and rend their garments, and they come often to do this. So then that's in 333. Islam comes and eventually takes Jerusalem, and the rock also becomes associated with Hierophanes, or is associated with Hierophanes in the Islamic tradition. It's the place associated with the night journey of the prophet and the ascension of the prophet. The night journey and the ascension are spoken of as a sort of completion of a cycle where the prophet receives, basically the uncreated unfolds into the created through the revelation to the prophet. And then the prophet, through the night journey, the created refolds back into the uncreated as the prophet ascends to heaven. And the night journey is talked about in the 17th chapter of the Quran, and what it says there. This is the first part. So the first bit is where he has to go from the Kaaba in Mecca, and he rides on Burak, the beast. You can see Burak here. And he's taken from the Kaaba to Jerusalem. So that's the first bit of it, and it's described this way in the Quran. Glorified be he who carried his servant from the inviolable place of worship to the far distant place of worship, the precincts whereof we have blessed. So these two places, the inviolable place of worship was identified with the Kaaba, and the far distant place of worship with Jerusalem. And then following the night journey, the ascension happens. So Muhammad ascends to the highest heaven, and his visions during this ascension are described in the Quran in Surah 53. He has 2 visions. So in Quran 53:9, it says that he comes to 2 bow lengths, or even nearer, and God revealed that which God revealed. It actually uses the word he instead of God, but he with a capital H revealed that which he revealed. That's the first vision. And the second vision was at the lote tree of the uttermost boundary, which is what's depicted here. This jeweled tree is al-Surat al-Muntaha, which is translated into English as the lote tree of the uttermost boundary. And this second vision is also described, and it says, at the lote tree of the utmost boundary, nigh on to the garden of abode, when that which shroudeth did enshroud the lote tree, his eye, Muhammad's eye, turned not aside, nor was it overbold. So Al-Tabari, who's a later historian, you could say, writes of the lote tree that it is rooted in the throne of God and marks the end of knowledge of every knower, be he archangel or prophet messenger. All beyond is a hidden mystery, unknown to any save God alone. So, and it's said that the footprint that Muhammad made when he mounted Burak to ascend to heaven can be seen on the rock, and also alongside that you can see the handprint of the angels who held down the rock that wanted to follow Muhammad in his ascension to heaven. So this night journey and the ascension of Muhammad, which is, again, this cycle of the uncreated unfolding into the created and the created folding back up into the uncreated. It becomes a model. It's like a model for spiritual journeys for Muslims, and work such as this, artwork such as this, is reminding them of that. And these would have been used, people would have looked at a picture such as this to remember that journey, and also to think about their own journey, their own spiritual journey. So these images are used to almost create a space for journeying for other people, one could say. So here again is the rock. Going back, within the Jewish tradition that was inherited most in large part by the early Muslims. The rock was considered as the omphalos, which is the center of centers, and the place where the infinite again breaks into the finite. And Mircea Eliade has done a lot of work on this, which is called, he refers to as the symbolism of the center. So he's collected material from many different times and places, which all refers to the symbolism of the center. And he describes this as one of the most widespread symbolisms. And I'll just tell you a little bit about this symbolism. The centers obviously don't represent a geographical center, but are spiritual centers. And because spiritual space is infinite and all-pervading, it reveals itself in a sanctified place. And so there can be numerous centers. And a center can be recognized by a group of people, and that situates the descent of the spirit into their world. Now, from those earlier Talmud and Midrash, we know that this place was known traditionally as the omphalos, the navel of the world, the foundation stone, where the first act of creation occurred. And a Syriac text, a later Syriac text, tells us also there about this place. There, in the center of the world, the four parts of the world have been united, one with the other. When God made the earth, his power went before, and the earth followed from the four sides, as swift as the winds. There his power stood and rested. So part of the symbolism of the center is that the center is reflected also in each world that has its own center. So the worlds sit one atop the other, coming from top all the way down, and each will have its own center, and all of those centers are connected by almost like an umbilical cord between all the navels, which is sometimes referred to as the axis mundi. And again, this is the place where creation begins, and all the possibilities of manifestation flow through this axis. Ibn Arabi comments that the degrees of heaven are as many in number as the degrees of hell, for each degree in the one has its counterpart in the other. Thus, were a stone to fall in heaven, it would of surety fall in a straight line in the corresponding degree in hell. So all of these connected worlds are related and reflections of one another. Even in Eastern traditions, the symbolism of the center comes into play, and it's referred to in Eastern traditions as the invariable middle. It's known as the place of the activity of heaven, and in Islam, this activity is called the descent of the Great Peace. I suppose it's a place where spirit and body come together, where there is a meeting point between spiritual and corporeal. And many of the constructions of man are made to sort of celebrate this symbolism, to mark the center, or the axis mundi, and I would include domes, towers, some cities themselves which are circular and have a central place. I'll show you some examples. This is a map of the cosmos, has Earth at the center, all the planets coming out, and the angels whirling it around from the corners. Here's the dome. This is actually the dome in the Dome of the Rock, and again, this is a symbol of that point at the center with everything, all of creation expanding out from it. And domes, I think, even more sort of refer to this through their finials. They'll either have a finial at the top, which is almost like a sort of pointing that axis mundi, or they'll have, as the Pantheon in Rome, they'll have an oculus, the hole at the top, which is an exit point from one world to the next. Towers such as this, I mean, this to me is, such a great example of axis mundi, which is sort of three layers with this lovely spherical ball on the top. This is a very common way to mark this space as well, a dome with 4 pillars underneath, and often, as we saw with the mercy seat with the 2 angels on either side, there's the 2 peacocks on either side, 2 lions on either side, 2 guardians of this central place, and the place of the Epiphany of the Virgin and Child underneath. Also, the omphalos or the axis mundi can be recognized in natural phenomena such as rocks or mountains or trees. And in this image, that's the center of the world on Mount Meru, and the Mandala Palace sits atop the center of the world, just like the Dome of the Rock sits atop the center of the world for the Abrahamic peoples. And this is a tree. Again, trees are also found at the center, and we can remember the lot tree from Muhammad's ascension, and from the tree that's described in Genesis that's at the center of the Garden of Eden. So the tree is like a pillar that unites heaven and the underworld, and again, the energies of the cosmos are pouring through this tree continuously into earthly creation. So all of this symbolism sits behind the place where this building was built. And when you walk into this building, you walk from a very light place. It's almost blindingly light outside, and you walk into the darkness, and this is sort of how it feels. You're walking into a very green and gold feeling place. It's very, those are the two predominant colors, and it's very dark, and yet it's glittery. It's very glittery. So these mosaics, most of them are from the time that the building was built, from the 7th century. And they're filled with, that's another, so the rock is right in the center there, and this arcade goes around the rock. But you can see the swirling growth patterns of all the mosaics. They're filled with trees. Here's one growing. Many of them are growing out of vases, out of water. There's another one, which I think this one actually has wings. I can't tell. So some of them have wings on them. Some of them have jewels on them. And this one, for example, looks completely different. So I was asking myself, okay, trees, why all these trees? And the explanation was always that they reminded people of paradise, at which I'm sure that's exactly what they do, but I think I wanted to know more. I wanted to think, well, what does that mean, being reminded of paradise? So I looked at the Quran. I started with the Quran and just started to look at the trees that were mentioned there. And the Quran mentions specifically 4 trees. The first one's the date palm, where Mary during childbirth grabs the date, the trunk of the date tree, and she's in pain and agony of childbirth, but she shakes the tree and dates fall into her lap to offer her nourishment during this time. And then there's the famous tree of the light verse, which is an olive tree that's neither of east or west, so it's definitely a central tree. We could say an axis mundi tree. And its light blazeth, no matter, even if it hasn't been lit. So it's a central tree and also a tree of light. And then there's the lot tree, which we've spoken about a little bit, which was this conduit for Muhammad's vision. And there was a 4th tree, which I could hardly find anything about, and it's called the Zakum tree, and it grew in hell. And I couldn't, as you can see, that's the only image I could find of it, and it's not a great one. But, and there's nothing, people would talk about all the trees and everything about them, but they would never say anything about this tree. They'd just say, and there was the Zakum tree. So, again, I just had to go to the Quran to look at what it was, and it seemed that it somehow reflected the trees of paradise. It had, while the fruit of the trees of the paradise would nourish and delight those who were fortunate enough to live in paradise at the time, those who entered the fire would also eat of a fruit. And the fruit of the tree of Zakum is described as being like molten brass, and it seethed in their bellies. And this tree also was said to grow in the heart of hell, and its crop was described as the heads of devils. So there weren't any of these trees in the Dome of the Rock, but it continued to intrigue me. What is the meaning or purpose of a tree like this? And returning to Ibn Arabi's words that I quoted previously, that there was a connection between this tree and the trees at the centers of the worlds all above, made me think that this place of the center was somehow a place of tension where opposites came together, and also a place where one could be moved somehow between one and the other, or seemingly where both of these things could exist together somehow. So it's a place of tension, and it's also a place of a potential change or movement. And I found a psalm at this time that seemed to suggest that this was something, helped me to understand it, I would say. Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down-sitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For here is not a word in my tongue. But lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand on me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain unto it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness darkeneth thee not, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and light are both alike to thee. So this all led me to see, in a sense, that there was a piece of the center in everything. It was everywhere, in a way. Even in this tree growing in the center of hell, and this piece of the center sometimes held opposing things together. And I started to read about early myths, which also Eliade collected, which he talked about as leading to the recognition of the coincidence of opposites. And he related these to the work of Nicholas of Cusa, who's also known for speaking of the coincidentia oppositorum, and also to the works of the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. And beyond all of this, there's one further thing about the center, and this was the thinking that there was an analogical relationship between the worlds with their center and man with his center, and which was identified with his heart. So, and the heart is actually used synonymously with the omphalos. Those two words are interchangeable. And so this analogy between manifestation or creation on a universal scale and manifestation on the scale of the individual started me to think about art's practice and creation, the creation of practitioners in relation to all of these ideas. And in all of these understandings and associated visions, creation or hierophany, both of them, occur at the center, where all of these opposites coincide, where there is balance and harmony in the place of the activity of heaven, which is also known in Islam as the divine station, which combines all contrast and antinomies. And if this is where creation was taking place, I wondered, what does this mean for the artist that's also involved in creation? And when I began to speak to some of my students about their practice, they also suggested that there were moments within the creative process when they felt that the dichotomies, heaven and earth, spirit and matter, metaphorical and literal, were less polarized. They were experienced differently, and it seemed as if there was a place, some in-between kind of station where something different was experienced. And because our research here is centered on arts practice and the thinking there, and I'm using that word thinking deliberately to speak about knowing through a participatory experience, through the process of knowing by participating in an experience. So that's the type of thinking that I'm talking about, but I do think it's thinking, and perhaps the most important thinking that can be done, so I do use that word deliberately there. And Dewey wrote about this as well, and he said, "The odd notion that an artist does not think and a scientific inquirer does nothing else is the result of converting a difference in tempo and emphasis into a difference in kind. The artist has his problems and thinks as he works, but his thought is more immediately embodied in the object. The artist does his thinking in the very qualitative media he works in, and the terms lie so close to the object that he is producing that they merge directly into it. So I wanted to look at this relationship between arts practice and knowing as it was being spoken of in relation to research degrees, because that's where they speak of it a lot, because they have to. And a model that's been very useful for thinking about this is one that was suggested by Robin Nelson, where he tries to show how different thinking is brought together in this place in the center, which is arts practice, what he calls it. He talks about theory and practice coming together here. So it's interesting the different types of knowledge that he speaks about. This is sort of, that is sort of outsider knowledge, so that's the more what we would think of as academic knowledge that might be gained through reading. Know what is more about what works, what methods to use. It's almost like technical knowledge. And know how is the close-up knowing, the things that happen through performance, the things that happen through repetitive action, and sort of the embodiment aspect. So all of these things were helpful, but all of my students, almost all, at least 2, 3, 4, 5, said, okay, that's all fine, but that thing in the center doesn't seem to be enough. It's sort of empty in the center. Okay, theory and practice are coming together, but, well, we could have told you that sort of thing. So I had to kind of turn to the work of others to see more about, and because I'd worked on the symbolism of the center, I started thinking, again about this relationship. So the people that helped me understand more about the process of creation and of embodiment are Henri Corbin, with his work on the act of imagination, and Robert Bosnak. Robert Bosnak worked with Henri Corbin and James Hillman, and he's very interested in embodiment and embodied imagination, and he relates this to dreaming. For him, dreaming is creating, it's world creating, it's a permanent act of creation, on par with the creation of the universe, he says. So he's making a connection between embodiment on an individual level and the creation of the universe as well. And he also is talking about the thinking that's happening, and he follows an early medieval distinction between two types of thinking, true imagination, or imaginatio vera, and confabulation, or phantasmagoria. For Bosnak, true imagination is embodied and substantive, while confabulation is a mental process akin to rational thinking. It's indirect, disembodied, controlling, grasping, trying to figure things out or make them up. That's how he describes it. So Corbin also talks about confabulation and describes it as a rational operation implying no transition either to a new plane of being or to a new depth of consciousness. So, and Bosnak feels that confabulation causes a loss of substance, and actually what he says is it erects a wall against the fresh. And when I read that, it reminded me of that quotation from Gerald Manley Hopkins that I had up at the beginning, that there's something, the dearest freshness in material. So a wall to that is erected by this confabulation. So I guess what I'd like to propose is that something of what happens at the center in the act of creation is the type of thinking that Bosnak is referring to when he speaks of imaginatio vera, embodied and substantive, and that the place of the human act of creation could be related to the world that Henri Corbin came to know of through his own engagement with all the visionary writings of Suhrawardi and Ibn Sina and Ibn Arabi and others. Based on his studies of these visionary texts, he describes imagination as an organ of perception that allows all phenomena to symbolize with each other in the same, and I think he describes it as the same sort of a relationship that happens with the octaves of music. So the middle C is middle C, and then the next C up is the same, but yet it's different. So it has some qualities that are the same and other qualities that are different. So there's a sameness and a difference, but one can see both those aspects. So he's talking about organ of perception that allows us to understand that. Let's see. What he talks about an immaterial materiality, and about a cognitive function of imagination that provides the foundation for rigorous analogical knowledge, permitting us to evade the dilemma of current rationalism, which gives us a choice between mind or matter. Now, Bosnak reminds us also, when in the act of creation, or embodying imagination, which is what he's interested in, you always have to guard against this confabulation, because it's thinking about the experience rather than engaging in the experience itself. So, how do we find a way between these two divided ways of thinking, confabulation and imaginatio vera? And again, maybe we return to the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum. John Dewey observed that once a work of art became the object of a critic's attention, it was separated from the experience of its creation. And he stated, when artistic objects are separated from both conditions of origin and operation in experience, a wall is built around them that renders them opaque. And he was always trying to speak about the experience of creation as impacting the work of art itself and the experience of the work of art. And he also was interested in Heraclitus, and felt that paradox revealed everyday ways of thinking about things were not adequate to the nature of reality. That paradox was something almost to cultivate, because it meant that you could rethink and change your thinking. And he talked about artists, and he himself was an artist, through their work as cultivating moments of resistance and tension because of their potential of bringing into consciousness an experience that is more unified and total. So, to quote him again, the world is full of things that are indifferent and even hostile to life. The very processes by which life is maintained tend to throw it out of gear with its surroundings. Nevertheless, if life continues, and if in continuing it expands, there is an overcoming of factors of opposition and conflict. There is a transformation of them into differentiated aspects of a higher powered and more significant life. Here in germ are balance and harmony attained through rhythm. Equilibrium comes about not mechanically and inertly, but out of and because of tension. Order is not made from without, but is made out of the relations of harmonious interactions that energies bear to one another. So here, tension and opposition are operating within the material world, and it's the energies of nature that are ordering this that are seen as potentially transformative. Order comes from within the tension and with nature's way of working with that tension. And this, I think, is in line with this idea of coincidentia oppositorum as potentially opening up new ways of understanding. And in relation to this sort of seeking tension, there were two artists whose work also helped me to understand the thinking that happens and this ideas of tension and trying to hold these oppositions and work with these oppositions in relation to imagination and in relation to material. And the first one is, of course, Blake. He's, of course, always been recognized as a visionary artist who uses both color and word to create. Patrick Harper notes that he was always uneasy with notions of the transcendence of the spiritual over the material, and his desire to remain close to matter and even to redeem it. Harper suggests that he found a way to do this through alchemical thinking, where spirit and matter, soul and body are never separated for long. They always come back together and then perhaps separate out again, but come back together. People talk about the Blakean double vision. He's noted for his ability to hold two things at the same time. And he claimed that without contraries, there is no progression. For Blake, I think Kathleen Rain's the one that suggests that it was imagination that held everything together. Both knowledge and art were recreation. He wrote, "Mental things alone are real." And Harper comments on this comment, saying, "These things are also called forms or images, the products, in other words, of imagination." And Kathleen Rain worked with his poetry and with his images side by side for years and years. I think her own doctoral research was done in this area, and it was sort of her obsession. And she talks of the work of the artist as an engagement in the binding of imaginative form through material. And Blake always described his own work as the nature of his work as visionary or imaginative. But in relation to this combination of vision and imagination, Kathleen Rain said that Blake's visionary experiences should not be considered hallucination. And she said instead that this was imaginative insight at work. So here's, the things that would happen to him, like his brother, after he died, came to him in a dream, and from that, his brother told him about a new technique for printing, and then he went off and used that technique and experimented with it, and it eventually left his old techniques behind. He was very inspired by Milton, and Milton also appeared to him in visions on many occasions, and this is from his illustration of Milton's Paradise Lost. It's Christ offers to redeem man. And then there's also this one, which is Satan watching the endearments of Adam and Eve. And another artist or thinker that was helpful to me in understanding this relationship between imagination, creation, the image, was Jung. Jung actually began to recognize in himself two types of thinking, and he referred to these two types of thinking as directed thinking and fantasy thinking. And for him, directed thinking was verbal and logical, while fantasy thinking was associative and imagistic. And in the beginning, he was fighting against himself in fantasy thinking. He was very skeptical of fantasy thinking and didn't even want to engage in it because he came from a much more academic setting. But he allowed himself to use his own experiences as a way of understanding the more dissociated work that he was doing, the sort of know that in Nelson's model. So he was trying to use the one to inform the other. And I think his work in this area to accept his own fantasy thinking, which would be the imaginatio vera of Bosnak, for example. I think it's the same thing. Is why someone like Bosnak can be able to he sort of opened up the way for this sort of thinking to be thought of as something that's worth looking at. Basically, the result of his engagement with this type of thinking was his Liber Novus, or the Red Book, which he said it was based on his evoking fantasy states or emptying his consciousness and then entering into them as into a drama. It was dramatized thinking in pictorial form, and he began to draw and paint, combining images and text in a way that reminded some people of Blake. And although this book is filled with references to philosophy and religion, he deliberately left out any sort of academic references. It was a decision to leave scholarship to one side, perhaps recognizing that type of thinking as confabulation. But this is his first drawing of a mandala that was eventually painted and became a series of mandalas. And here's how the Red Book looked. It's been recently published, so it's sort of come out, and that's how a page from it looks. So he was writing and drawing, and then some of the drawing, that's one of the drawings there. So, but he continued to work on this every night after a day of working with patients, and he eventually began to encourage his patients to do the same thing, and a sort of new model of psychotherapy emerged from these experimentations. But in 1930, he was given an alchemical text from the East, The Golden Flower, and this took him away from his Liber Novus, and his efforts shifted to alchemy. So both Jung and Blake recognized that alchemy offered a way for them to work that was sympathetic with this imaginatio vera, this way of thinking that was more imagistic. And so why did both Blake and Jung turn to alchemy in the quest to understand this relationship between spirit and matter, between imagination and creation? I think it's because alchemy is a process of engagement. It's an experience of knowing rather than a body of knowledge to be understood. So it's all about the process. Aaron Cheek, who's written a lot about alchemy, talks about it as a non-dual process with the capacity for interweaving between different states of existence. So like Corbin's imagination, its sphere of operation is in a way between domains where spirit is made body and body is made spirit, like Mircea, the prophetessa, says in her quote here. So to describe it, it's the slow process of creation and dissolution with familiar boundaries and fixed states shifting and disappearing. And that's why the stages of it and the personages associated with it are all muddy and shifty and changing. They're one thing one moment and it's opposite the next. And I think that's the beauty of it, actually. I'm not an expert in it, and it's something that, like creative art, has to be known through experience rather than talked about or read about. But I just want to share some of the thinking that's helped me to understand more about material and about the process of creation. So I'll speak just about the role of material in alchemy and the color phases of alchemy. But first, I'd just like to say something about the method. The method has been described in an alchemical text, and it says that the method is natural, breathing in and breathing out, keeping the orders of method, increasing and decreasing, and all things by division and union come together in a harmony, and nature is transformed. And the goal, I think, is, everyone who talks about it says the goal is the work itself. It's not making something new, but revealing something that's already there. Cheek writes a bit about this. He says, in understanding the goal of alchemy as perfection, it must be realized that the perfection is not teleological, but perennial. The primordial nature does not exist in the future, nor should it be confused with the past. It's ever present and ever originating. And again, that's similar to our discussion of tradition from the very beginning, which we spoke of, that it's not the primordial matter, which is what is the sort of you're working with at all time, is always there, and it's always changing, and it's always coming into being. And all the writers that I've read about who've talked about alchemy agree with what Eliade has written, that the alchemist takes up and perfects the work of nature while at the same time working to make him or herself. The alchemist and their material are repeatedly dissolved and re-embodied in a simultaneous transformation. Harper says the work takes place in a realm intermediate between mind and matter, in which material processes and psychic transformations interpenetrate. So this is an alchemical drawing showing the materia prima that we start. That's the beginning and the end, actually. And these little squares represented, and you can see that they're all over. They're on the land, in the water, in the mountains, and they're everywhere. So it all begins and ends with the prima materia, and this is the idea that it begins and ends with the same thing is sort of how the whole thing is. That every term has seemingly opposing meanings, and you never quite understand where you are. And I think again that's the beauty of the whole thing. So the source material for the lapis can be found everywhere, in the earth, on the mountains, in the air, and in the water. It is both common, found everywhere, and precious. It contains the potential for all things. The artist James Elkins, describes it as a way station between utter chaos and perfection, encompassing every substance, but in an occluded form. So Bosnak, again, who's always talking about embodiment, he explains that the alchemist considered matter as existing in a state of continuous creation, containing sparks of live creative forces. And the process of working with this material is what he describes as one of extreme slow motion, of participation in this ongoing creative force, this creative process of the materia prima. And through this slow motion and participation in the ongoing creative process, eventually this primal matter begins to pervade the alchemist, and he could partake of the intelligence of the material. So the material contained an intelligence inside, these sparks of intelligence. And Bosnak talks about this again occurring in an in-between world, and he says that this in-between world flies in the face of our Cartesian understanding that intelligence comes from humans who direct it towards objects. In the case of alchemy, instead, in this in-between space, a meeting place between subjects, the alchemists and their metal, or even you and I, it releases mutual intelligence, and that's transformational. And the material and its potential for transformation is described in a further quote from the Rosarium Philosophorum. According to the true principle of nature, you should know that you do not need many things, just one. There is just one stone, one medicine, one vessel, one method, one arrangement. There is only one single thing. The rich as well as the poor have it. It is found everywhere. It is assimilated in all things, and is composed of soul, spirit, and body, and can convert from one nature into another until it becomes of perfect grade. Reducing bodies to their primal matter, or alive silver, is nothing other than dissolving frozen matter, by way of which a lock opens and one nature can enter into another. So this passing from one nature into another was represented by the color stages of alchemy. And Harper says there were either 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, 12. In other words, there were lots of different formatting of these color stages. But these stages represented movements between gross and perfected. So that whole movement is framed by these color stages. And Bosnak says the color stages are not only chemical changes to minerals, but since the minerals have intelligence, these are alterations in embodied consciousness as well. Again, I know from my students who've worked with these stages as a framework that they never move along a linear path, and the writers say this too, that it's never linear or neat. They move in unexpected ways. Some stages are taking place at the same time. There are stages within stages. Stages are achieved and then lost again. And so it's all about this process and learning through this process. And in a way, I think their purpose is just to provide some structure, if it's even muddy and shifting. So here, I went ahead there. Here, this illustration shows 4 of the stages: the Negredo, which is black, the Albedo, which is white, the Citrinitas, which is yellow, and the Rubedo, which is a reddish purple. And I want to just describe those 4 stages, and also talk about the greening, which precedes the whole work, or it's part of the work, but it's before the Negredo. Okay. There's an alchemical treatise called the Splendor Solis, and it talks about the stone arising from growing and greening things, whereby what is green is reduced again to its natural state. And Bosnak explains this a bit, saying that the greening force that's present in nature it's visible, it's like a visible power in the springtime. And the alchemists collected all kinds of natural forms in which greening was seen, and in which it sort of momentarily, this power was momentarily expressed. And these were destroyed to release their greening force. The essence of nature was extracted. And for example, copper was perceived as a mineral manifestation of this greening force. And for Bosnak, the destruction of the green represents, he says it's a corruption of innocence, and that the work begins with this corruption of innocence. And then we move on to the negredo, the black stage. When the greening dissipates, it turns to black, like it does at the end of summer. And Bosnak relates this to he talks about the death of the old king. That's one of the sort of personages of alchemy. The death of the old king is like when an old rule disintegrates and sinks back into the animating matrix of being. It's a time of not knowing, of turmoil. What has been known evaporates, everything turns to sludge, it's blacker than black. And although everything seems lost, the work of breaking down the dead matter begins very slowly. And if Bosnak warns that if we look at black only as the absence of light, we will not see that it has its own inner value as an evacuating force. It's getting rid of something and allowing something else to come about. And actually, sometimes at this stage, we hear of the dark night of the soul, or the mythical journey to the underworld, and I think these are related to the negredo, the blackness. They're like the negredo, they're necessary for change to take place. And again, like all of these stages, the negredo is always there. It's always possible. It's always possible to be in it's there at all times. At the end of this stage, or sometimes during this stage, there's a moment that's referred to as the peacock's tail. And it's a first flash of light in the darkness. And Bosnak sees the essence of this moment as display, appearance, and vibrancy of color, sparks of inspiration, a moment when he talks about pure creative spirit entering into the agony of embodiment. The artist or thinker will recognize it as a time after a fallow time when every sparkle represents a potential something that might develop into a fresh new image. And then we move into the albedo stage, which is white and silver and related to the moon. And so it's a reflective stage after all those ideas coming out of the peacock's tail. So it's single-mindedness, an idea that we can take hold of, and it also makes room for reflection. But Bosnak says silver tarnishes easily and needs constant polishing in order to keep its reflectiveness. So paying slow and concentrated attention to particulars helps embodiment, while flashes of abstraction only feed the busy mind. So this is it's a time when things are both poetic and accurate. So there's reflection and there's also single-mindedness. You're getting rid of all the haze of the black, and the sort of blindness of the black time becomes self-aware. And through that, subtle matter emerges as different from the desiccated green, but still related to the desecrated green. And then you move into citrinitas, which is the yellow. And Bosnak starts by saying reflection's not enough. The reflection has to be fermented. It has to be, they speak of it as being reconfigured underground in order to bear fruit. So he talks about the yellow phase as a time of practice and rehearsal, a time when reflected images like leavened bread gain more and more body. Outside, nothing seems to happen, but fermentation brews underneath. And he also speaks of the other parts of this, aspects of this, like the jaded yellow, because we've seen it all before, and the fresh insights are less important. The highs and the lows are sort of more equalized. And also he talks about the yellow belly of cowardice, where we might be afraid of the image that has come through reflection, and through fear we just leave the whole thing and give it all up. But it can be the first pale dawn after a full moon night and before the bright red sunrise. It's this time of gestation. And the next phase is the rubedo, which is the sunrise, where a fresh creative spirit enlivens this leavened body, and there's a concrete act which retains self-awareness without losing spontaneity. So the rubedo is a fresh infusion of fermented reflections driving an act of embodied metaphor which spans unbearable tension, catalyzing all it touches into its own highest value. This is like the red of the rising sun, which infuses what it touches with its golden presence. So I've tried to talk about the practice of the artist and the space of creation. Okay, I'm almost done. Sorry. This is the very last slide, and then and I will stop talking. I've tried to talk about the practice of the artist and the space of creation in relation to a place where there's a break in normal reality, where things which are normally opposite coincide. And to consider the embodiment of the image, which is what's happening in this place at the center of Nelson's model of knowing, as an operation of imagination where literal meets metaphorical and where a different type of thinking can take place. Harper describes the experience of creation as similar to deep absorption or enchantment by another person, object, or activity, where we're completely self-forgetful and we merge with the object of attention. And I think that this type of attention can shift patterns. It can change how we see things, and it can change what we see. This slowing down and attention, through this seeing something different may be awakened. And it always reminds me, thinking of this always reminds me of Persephone on the threshold before her descent into the Negredo, into the underworld. And she doesn't happen upon the door through any other way besides an experience of seeing a flower, through an aesthetic experience. And the journey begins with an aesthetic experience. And Persephone, like so many travelers, has her eyes opened through an aesthetic experience, through paying attention to the poetry and the metaphor of the world. Corbin describes his aesthetic experience of contemplating an image, saying, "To contemplate this image is to enter a multidimensional world, a unity of qualitative time in which past and future are simultaneously present." And this, again, is this double vision, this coincidence of opposites, and those two opposing things being held at the same time. And this leads me to think about, when we work in this way, seeing our material as poetic and using imaginative thinking and creative energy to unite the literal with the metaphorical and to draw the imaginative into matter. When we come to know all of this through the experience of the process of creation and potentially create the poetic ground of experience for others, what types of images emerge from that kind of work? And I'd just like to end with some of the images that can come out. and that's the last one.